the problem of social suffering has not yet become a legitimate object of study in the human and social sciences. There is still a prejudice in academic debate that social suffering is a conceptually ill-defined problem because it doesn't fit into established disciplinary divisions. At best, it's perceived as an objective and theoretically relevant experience, but one that can only inspire psychological or moral reflections. As Emmanuel Bueno has often reminded, philosophy itself has contributed to this prejudice. From an orthodox Marxist perspective, for example, social suffering is seen as a secondary political problem. The priority is to denounce exploitation, domination, and economic injustice, of which social suffering must be seen as the effect. Republican thought, inspired by Hannah Arendt, carries out a similar concealment. The sharp division between the sphere of needs and the public political sphere leads to considering suffering as a private matter on which there is no room for rational reflection or public deliberation. This prejudice has very real effects on the idea of politics of some currents of traditional trade unionism and the communist left. From the moment that politics is identified with major confrontations in the masculine public space, suffering is perceived as an individualistic, feminine, and petit bourgeois malaise. This prejudice undermines not only the academic legitimacy of the subject of social suffering, but also its visibility in the public space. The worrying consequence of this double opacity is the collective tolerance and trivialization of suffering and other social pathologies, as Christophe Dejour has pointed out, as you know. In this talk, I would like to focus on an additional difficulty in approaching the problem of social suffering from a philosophical perspective. Unlike the previous ones, this is not an ideological difficulty, but a difficulty internal to the object of study itself. It is what, in very general terms, I will call the communicability of social suffering. In its various forms, malaise is an experience that individuals live in the first person. As social researchers, we are confronted with the difficulty of understanding an intimate experience that we have not usually experienced or have not experienced with the same degree of intensity. Of course, empirical research from sociology or psychopathology provides us with tools to embody our analytical models. We have interviews, testimonies, and clinical studies that allows us to know how suffering is experienced in the singularity of a body or an individual history. But this resource in turn raises new questions. How should we analyze the account that individuals give of their suffering? How far are we legitimized to conduct the work of interpretation? How can we represent the suffering of others without altering the subject's experience or speaking on their behalf? Are we authorized to translate their spontaneous forms of expression into intellectual language? Or should we present their discourse without mediation? Is it possible to do so without validating the representation, perhaps erroneous, that the individual has about the causes of their suffering? This set of difficulties is aggravated when the subject is not able to articulate a discourse about his or her suffering. The individual may lack the linguistic or cultural capital necessary to put into words what he feels. In even more radical cases, he may be unable to talk about his pain because he or she has forgotten the event that provoked it or has repressed it in order to survive. I'm thinking of cases of sexual abuse or atrocious experiences such as torture, and I refer to Olga Belmontes, a colleague from our department, excellent book, Víctimas e Ilesos, ensayo sobre la resistencia ética. When this happens, when the subject is willing or unable to talk about his or her suffering, how can we make a theory of silence? The problem I am trying to conceptualize, the relationship between suffering, speech, and theory, entered the concerns of critical philosophy in the late 60s. There are, in my opinion, two emblematic moments that illustrate this transition. The first is Michel de Certeau's interpretation of May 68 a few months after the events. For de Certeau, May 68 is not a traditional revolt. The political objective of the insurgent students and workers was not to conquer state power, but to invert the symbolic laws that establish difference of capacity between individuals and determine who is fit and who is unfit to speak. May 68 is above all a revolution of speech. De Certeau writes, I read that in French, En mai dernier, on a pris la parole comme on a pris la Bastille en 1789. This well-known statement by de Certeau interprets May 68 as the conquest of a revolutionary political right from which all others follow, the right of any individual to speak for himself without the need for representatives or tutelary figures. The second emblematic moment I would like to bring up is Foucault's conversation with Deleuze, published under the title Les intellectuels et le pouvoir. In the 1972 interview, the two philosophers draw out the consequences of de Certeau's discovery in the fields of theory. If May 68 has shown that individuals can speak for themselves, that they don't need intellectuals to become aware of their condition or to lead their political struggle, then the role of theory and the position of intellectuals must be questioned. On the one hand, theory loses the totalizing function it had played up to that point. Its mission is no longer to explain the reasons for the malaise of social agents or to guide their strategies of insubordination to the existing order of things. As Foucault and Deleuze comment, theory does not express, explain, or translate a practice. Theory is itself a practice, a toolbox that must serve individuals to free themselves from oppression. On the other hand, the intellectual renounces the dual power or the dual function of representation that he had exercised in the 19th century. It's a literal quote, to tell the truth to those who could not see it, and in the name of those who could not say it. Since May 68, the intellectual can no longer aspire to be the conscience or the universal spokesperson of the oppressed. He must be content to play a more modest role, to help the oppressed to speak for themselves, to express their desires and their demands in concrete social institutions, in prisons, hospitals, universities, and so on. The consequence of this is a categorical moral imperative. From now on, non-critical philosophy, worthy of the name, can commit the indignity of speaking in the name of the other. It is those oppressed by the system who must account for their domination. And it is the practical intelligence that must lead the political struggle ahead of the science of the intellectuals, the revolutionary vanguard, or the party apparatus. In Can the Subaltern Speak, Gayatri Spivak makes very severe criticism of the ideas of Foucault and Deleuze in this interview. She accuses both of ignoring their position as intellectuals in the power system she accuses both of ignoring their position as intellectuals in the power system and of holding a Eurocentric and androcentric view of emancipatory politics. According to Spivak, This renders them incapable of perceiving the epistemic violence that imperialism and the international division of labor exert on subaltern subjects in the third world, especially women. In other words, the right to speech is a luxury that the subaltern third world subject cannot always afford. Spivak's critique makes sense and deserves to be discussed, but it also seems to me a bit one-sided. Spivak reproaches Foucault and Deleuze for lacking answers to questions that they don't ask themselves, questions that their theoretical presuppositions prevent them from answering. It is true that Foucault lacks a theory of domination and political action on the macro-logical scale of imperialism. But this is not a weak point in his argument, but the necessary consequence of a theory that thinks of power and the political action of intellectuals at a local and determined level. Moreover, Spivak's judgment prevents her from assessing the real political effects of Foucault-Deleuze ideas on power, intellectuals, and the right of the oppressed to speak. These ideas find a direct political translation, for example, in Foucault's militant activity in the group d'Information sur les prisons. As you know, this platform, coordinated by Foucault, seeks to give prisoners a voice in order to inform public opinion about the intolerable nature of the French prison system. The group assumes that prisoners do not need the intervention of intellectuals to become aware of the condition of their oppression. Those who know best the innate nature of domination are those who suffer domination in their own flesh. Prisoners, not intellectuals, must speak out first. Foucault writes, « Il s'agit de laisser la parole à ceux qui ont une expérience de la prison. Non pas qu'il s'ait besoin qu'on laisse la prendre conscience, la conscience de l'oppression est là, parfaitement claire, sachant bien qui est l'ennemi. Mais le système actuel lui refuse les moyens de se formuler, de s'organiser. » In another text from the same period, Foucault insists on this idea. Le GIP ne se propose pas de parler pour les détenus des différentes prisons. Il se propose au contraire de leur donner la possibilité de parler eux-mêmes et de dire ce qui se passe dans les prisons. Le but du GIP n'est pas réformiste, nous ne rêvons pas d'une prison idéale. Nous souhaitons que les prisonniers puissent dire ce qui est intolérable dans le système de la répression pénale. Consequently, the task of the intellectuals participating in the group is not to represent the suffering or rationalize the demands of the oppressed, nor is it to offer an external or objective analysis of the prison system. Their aim is to activate autonomous processes of collective enunciation among the prisoners. Prisoners are not the passive objects of intellectual research, but the authors of a discourse on their conditions of existence and the active subjects of their emancipation. This does not mean that intellectuals should be evacuated from the political struggle. The GIP's innovation consists in creating links of complicity between prisoners, intellectuals and professionals from different files, between those oppressed by the system and those who make its machinery work, doctors, lawyers, judges, prison officers, etc. The ultimate aim is to interview the reasons of specific intellectuals with the reasons and practices of the social actors who suffer domination at first hand. The experience of the GIP teaches social philosophy two things. First of all, that social suffering can only be politicized by taking into account the experience and discourse of the subject who suffered. And secondly, that the task of intellectuals is not to clarify the reasons of those who suffer, or to correct their ideological mystification, but to recognize and empower the capacity of anyone to speak for himself and give reasons for his suffering. The work of Jacques Rancière is the exact extension of these two postulates. In his texts of the 70s and 80s, Rancière carries out an important revision of the workers' question in the 19th century. His analysis is heterodox for at least two reasons. First, because Rancière argues that the working class does not constitute a monolithic identity, but a broad space of subjectivation, a space made up of heterogeneous forms of identification, multiple experiences of life and insubordination, and numerous zones of transit between working class and bourgeois culture. Secondly, Rancière's analysis is heterodox because he does not carry out a history of the workers' movement, starting from the experience of struggle, labor, or misery, as is usual in social history. Rancière chooses to focus on the discursive production of the dominated classes, and he chooses to analyze this discursive production in itself. This means that Rancière does not study working class identity through the portrayal of it by the antagonistic class. He does not study it through its recording in the discourse of Marx or other social doctrines. Rancière turns to the archive to study workers' discourse in its materiality. It is the workers themselves who now take the floor. It is they who are recognized as having the right to represent themselves and to narrate their own history. In the preface to La Nuit des Prolétaires, Rancière writes: La Nuit des Prolétaires. On ne verra dans ce titre aucune métaphore. Il ne s'agit pas ici de remémorer les douleurs des esclaves de la manufacture, l'insalubrité des taudis ouvriers ou la misère des corps épuisés par une exploitation sans contrôle. De tout cela, il ne sera question qu'à travers le regard et la parole, les raisons et les rêves des personnages de ce livre. The study of the workers' archive offers Rancière a surprise that is important to underline. A surprise similar to the one that the voice of the prisoners produced in Foucault. In the interview with Deleuze, Foucault comments that when the prisoners began to speak, they already had their own theory of prison, of criminality, and of justice. In other words, the prisoners were intelligent beings, individuals fully aware of their condition and capable of deliberating rationally about it. That is why they could judge their situation as intolerable. Rancière discovers something similar in the Workers' Archive, where the social historian would have bet on finding a mournful lament or the savage cry of misery. Rancière finds the voice of intelligence. In La Parole ouvrière, he writes: Les ouvriers ne parlent pas d'abord pour gémir ou menacer. Ils parlent pour être compris. Ils parlent pour être reconnus comme autre chose que la force du nombre et la vigueur des bras, manière d'outils ou des fusils. Pour montrer que les ouvriers peuvent dire ce qui est juste et raisonnable, qu'il faut leur faire place, non pas parce qu'ils sont les plus forts, mais parce que cette place est conforme à l'ordre de la justice et de l'histoire. Non pas cri des bas-fonds souffrants de la société, mais voix de l'intelligence. Rancière's research reminds us of something that social philosophy has often forgotten: the fact that the popular classes do more than work, suffer, and struggle, and that when they speak or write, their voice expresses something more complex than a feeling of displeasure. Rancière finds poems written by workers that copy the style of the great Romantic poets. He finds metaphysical reflections on beauty or eternity and moral declamations aligned with bourgeois norms. The voice Rancière finds in the archives expresses sophisticated sentiments, complex ideas, and very lofty aspirations, but also very banal, very petit bourgeois sentiments, such as the pleasure that one of these workers, the carpenter Goni, takes in a Sunday walk in the countryside, accompanied by some friends. This surprising discovery provokes important modifications in Rancière's own philosophy. From that moment on, Rancière was in earnest search of a method and a style of writing that would allow him to transcribe the worker's voice without betraying its meaning. What is needed is a method and a style of writing that allows the reasons of the workers to be read as reasons and not as an expression of suffering. The most conclusive result of this research is his doctoral thesis, published under the title La Nuit des Prolétaires. At no point in the book does Rancière's voice become apparent. He intermingles his own voice with the voice of the workers who constitute his object of study. Rancière does not use contextualizations, explanatory structures, or causal linkages. Instead of explaining the worker's discourse, Rancière composes a discursive intrigue in which blocks of words react to each other, configuring an autonomous world of signification. In La Nuit des Prolétaires, Rancière rehearses a novel way of relating the discourse of the other. He invites us to modify the epistemic frameworks we use to perceive the subaltern subject. Instead of as a victim or a mute subject, Rancière proposes to perceive the subaltern as a rational subject who can make use of his intellectual faculties to express the just and the unjust. And he invites us to practice a way of doing and writing philosophy that can do away with the mediations between the reasons of the intellectual and the reasons of the oppressed. Rancière's method is a direct provocation against the way sociology and social history have tended to represent the voice of the subaltern classes. If we read what Bourdieu, for example, writes in La misère du monde or in Ce que parler veut dire, we will find the opposite extreme to Rancière's method. Bourdieu argues that the social researcher cannot be so naive as to accept the discourse of the subaltern as it presents itself spontaneously. Left to themselves, social agents are incapable of understanding the reasons for their malaise and of putting adequate words to their suffering. The intervention of the sociologist remedies this double incapacity. On the one hand, it enables the dominated classes to become aware of their domination and to understand the social structures that determine it. On the other hand, the sociologist makes explicit the influence that these social structures exert on the discourse of the subaltern subject. The sociologist inserts the subaltern discourse into a framework of intelligibility that reveals its truth, its necessity, and its unconscious content. According to Bourdieu, the voice of the subaltern cannot be read without mediation. It's necessary to explain the voice of the subaltern as the necessary result of a whole series of social conditioning and class habitus. Contrary to what Rancière thinks, the voice of the subaltern can only be understood if we apply to it a maximum of interpretation, a maximum of explanation of the objective social relations that determine it. The interview technique proposed by Bourdieu is consistent with this idea. Bourdieu argues that a good interview should not transcribe the subaltern's discourse in its literal form. It's necessary to precede the interview with an indication of the individual history of the interviewee, his background and his work, his voice, his pronunciation, his intonation, rhythm, and body posture. We are in fact faced with two very different ways of thinking about the relationship between social suffering, speech, and theory. Rancière's approach allows us to elaborate a more complex image of the subaltern subject and his discourse, while avoiding victimizing discourses and sociological reductionisms. Rancière reminds us that the voice of the subaltern is an intelligent voice that must be heard and narrated as such. However, his anti-sociological perspective overlooks the way in which social structures influence the discourse of the subaltern subject, what this subject says, and also what he can say. Rancière ignores the social conditions that regulate access to speech and the production of discourse. Academic and cultural capital, the internal laws of linguistic files, and so on. Bourdieu, for his part, perhaps attributes too much weight to this symbolic violence. His theoretical model seems to rule out in advance the possibility of the unforeseen. For example, it rules out that the subaltern subject speaks when socially he should not be able to do so, or that his discourse expresses ideas contrary to those that determine his class habitus. It's not easy to resolve the mésentente between Rancière and Bourdieu, but I think critical philosophy will benefit from thinking through this tension and addressing the problems it poses. As critical philosophers, we cannot give up the task of identifying the sources of social malaise, but we must bring to the fore the experience and discourse of damaged lives. We must make social suffering visible and denounce the social relation that causes it, but without setting ourselves up as the representative conscience of those who suffer. Critical philosophy can democratize itself without renouncing to produce normative criteria or global diagnosis of the state of society. It can do so if it promotes practices of co-construction of critique together with the social agents themselves. Thank you very much.